The great hall fell silent as the Alpha King unrolled the ancient scroll before the assembled court, his dark eyes burning with desperate intensity as he spoke words that would shatter kingdoms and reshape destinies. But it was not his proclamation that would echo through history. It was her refusal. The storm had been building for weeks, deep within the crumbling ruins of the lunar sanctuary, where moonlight once blessed the sacred ground and ancient priestesses had whispered prayers to the celestial goddess. Royal guards discovered something that should have remained buried. Beneath layers of stone and centuries of neglect, sealed behind runes that pulsed with ethereal silver light, lay a scroll wrapped in cloth that had not decayed despite the passage of countless years. The captain of the guard knew immediately that this was no ordinary artifact. The symbols etched into the wax seal belonged to the primordial tongue of the ancestral Lunas, a language spoken only by the first leaders of the werewolf kingdoms, a language lost to time and memory. When he brought the scroll to the castle, wrapped carefully in blessed silk, the weight of its importance pressed down upon everyone who glimpsed it. Alpha King. Alternac stood at the window of his private chambers when the captain arrived, his massive frame silhouetted against the dying light. His long black hair fell past his shoulders, wild and untamed like the wolf that lived beneath his skin. His beard framed a face carved from granite and shadows, a face that had witnessed too many battles, endured too many losses, commanded too much power for too many years. His hands, scarred from warfare and stained with the blood of enemies, gripped the stone windowsill as though he could crush it to dust. He was a king who ruled through strength and fear. His enemies trembled at the mention of his name. His allies obeyed without question. His people respected the order he maintained through sheer force of will. But behind the closed doors of the castle, in the quiet hours when night pressed against the walls, Alternac was utterly, devastatingly alone. His marriage to Queen Lysandra Nymus had been arranged 7 years prior, a political necessity to unite two powerful pacts and prevent war from consuming the northern territories. She was beautiful, intelligent, and capable. She performed her duties with cold efficiency. They shared a bed when protocol demanded it. They appeared together at ceremonies. They spoke when necessary. But there was no warmth between them, no laughter, no stolen glances or whispered secrets. Their union was a contract written in duty and sealed with resignation. Lysandra had her own chambers, her own life, her own carefully maintained distance, and Alternac had learned not to expect anything more. He told himself it was enough. Kings did not marry for love. They married for stability, for alliances, for the good of their people. But in the darkest hours, when even his wolf grew quiet with loneliness, Alternac wondered what it might feel like to be wanted for something other than his power. When the captain entered with the scroll, explaining what the guards had found, Alternac felt a strange stirring in his chest. Hope, perhaps, or simply the need for distraction from the hollow echo of his own existence. He dismissed the captain and spent the night studying the scroll, trying to decipher symbols that danced and shifted before his eyes like living things. By dawn, frustration had turned to obsession. He summoned every scholar in the kingdom. Priests who had devoted their lives to studying ancient texts arrived with stacks of reference materials and left hours later, defeated and apologetic. Sages who claimed to know forgotten languages examined the scroll and shook their heads in bewilderment. Even the oldest elders of the Werewolf Council, who remembered stories passed down through generations, could only identify the language by name. None could read it. The primordial tongue had been dead for over 1,000 years. Before we continue with the story, I want to thank everyone who supports the channel and loves our Alpha King romances. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, please consider clicking the link in the pinned comment to check out our Patreon and become a member. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive content you won't find here on YouTube, extended stories, special scenes, early access to new episodes, and complete romance arcs created just for our supporters. As a bonus, you'll also unlock exclusive vampire romance stories, diving into darker, more intense love stories filled with desire, danger, and passion. By joining, you're directly supporting the channel and helping us bring even more immersive stories to life. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from and how old you are. I hope you enjoy the story. But the scroll was not merely a historical curiosity. The elders spoke in hushed, worried tones about what such documents might contain. Warnings from the founders, prophecies about the fate of kingdoms, spiritual instructions that could affect the balance of power between pacts and determine the legitimacy of rulers. If the scroll contained information vital to the throne, ignoring it could bring ruin. But without translation, it remained nothing more than beautiful, incomprehensible symbols. Political tensions were already mounting. 3 pacts to the south had been skirmishing over territory disputes. The Western Alliance was fracturing over trade disagreements. Rumors circulated that some pacts questioned whether Alternac truly possessed the spiritual authority to rule, whether his marriage to Lysandra had been blessed by the moon goddess or merely sanctioned by mortal ambition. The timing of the scroll's discovery felt ominous, as though the ancestors themselves were sending a message that the king ignored at his peril. Alternac issued commands to search every corner of the realm for anyone who might possess knowledge of the ancient language. Guards rode out to libraries, monasteries, and remote villages. Days passed with no success. Then, one evening, a young soldier returned with an unusual report. In a small town on the kingdom's eastern border, there lived a translator of modest means who had gained a reputation among locals for her strange ability to decipher symbols no one else could read. She had no formal education in ancient languages, no prestigious teachers or noble lineage. She worked in a cramped shop filled with old books and broken artifacts, taking commissions from merchants and travelers who needed documents translated. But those who visited her spoke of something uncanny in the way she worked, as though she did not read the languages so much as hear them speaking to her across the centuries. Her name was Felicia Lupotter. The soldier described her as young, unremarkable in appearance except for her unusual coloring. White hair that fell in soft waves around a face too pale for someone who worked in dusty obscurity, and eyes that seemed to hold depths that did not match her humble circumstances. She wore simple dresses in deep crimson, the color of blood and sacrifice, and she lived alone in rooms above her shop. Alternac did not hesitate. He sent guards to bring her to the castle immediately. They arrived 3 days later, escorting a carriage through the castle gates as nobles and servants craned their necks to catch a glimpse of the woman who might solve the mystery that had consumed the kingdom. When Felicia Lupotter stepped out onto the cobblestones, wrapped in a red cloak against the autumn chill, whispers rippled through the gathered crowd. She was small, almost fragile in appearance, with skin so pale it seemed to glow in the afternoon light. Her white hair was unbound, catching the breeze like threads of starlight. She did not lower her gaze or cower under the weight of so many stares. Instead, she looked up at the castle with calm, assessing eyes, as though she were examining an interesting puzzle rather than arriving at the seat of immense power. The guards led her through corridors lined with portraits of long-dead kings, past chambers where nobles conducted their endless political schemes, and finally into the great hall where the court had assembled. Hundreds of eyes turned to watch her enter. Laughter and cruel whispers followed in her wake. "A commoner," they murmured. "A girl who played with old books. How desperate had their king become to summon such a creature?" Alternac sat on his throne at the far end of the hall, a massive chair of carved black wood that seemed to absorb the light around it. He wore his crown, a circlet of silver embedded with moonstone, and his ceremonial robes that marked him as sovereign. But it was his presence, not his regalia, that dominated the space. He radiated power and danger, a predator barely restrained by the trappings of civilization. When Felicia reached the base of the throne steps, the guards stopped and bowed. She remained standing, her hands folded calmly before her, meeting the king's gaze with steady composure. Alternac studied her for a long moment. She was nothing like what he had expected, not cowering or awed by her surroundings, not desperately grateful for the summons. She simply stood there, waiting, as though she had all the time in the world and nothing to prove. Something about her stillness unsettled him. He rose from the throne, descending the steps with deliberate slowness. When he reached the floor of the hall, he towered over her, his massive frame casting her in shadow. Still, she did not flinch. The court watched in breathless anticipation. Alternac gestured, and a servant hurried forward carrying the scroll on a cushion of black velvet. The king took it, feeling the strange warmth of the ancient parchment against his palms, and unrolled it before Felicia. The silver runes gleamed in the torchlight, alive and shifting, beautiful and incomprehensible. Silence fell over the hall, so complete that the crackle of flames in the hearth seemed deafening. Alternac's voice, when he spoke, carried through the vast space with absolute authority. "Tell me what this says, and I will crown you as my Luna." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled nobles. Gasps echoed. Someone dropped a goblet, and the crash of metal against stone rang out like a gunshot. Courtiers turned to one another, whispering frantically, their faces displaying various degrees of outrage, confusion, and scandalous delight, because everyone knew that Alternac already had a Luna. Queen Lysandra sat in her own throne to the left of the king's, her face a mask of perfect composure, even as her knuckles whitened where she gripped the armrests. She had been his wife for 7 years. She had sacrificed her freedom, her dreams, her very identity to become the Luna this kingdom required. And now, before the entire court, her husband was offering her position to a common translator. The insult was devastating. The implications were catastrophic. But Alternac's eyes never left Felicia's face. He was waiting for her reaction, waiting to see ambition or greed or desperation flash across those calm features, waiting for her to realize the magnitude of what he was offering, and to grasp for it with both hands. Every woman in the kingdom would kill for such an opportunity. Power, status, wealth beyond imagining, the chance to stand beside the most feared alpha in the realm. Felicia looked down at the scroll. Her white hair fell forward, obscuring her expression. The court held its breath. When she reached out, her fingers did not tremble. She touched the parchment gently, almost reverently, tracing the silver runes with careful attention. Her lips moved silently, forming sounds that had not been spoken in 1,000 years. The torches flickered. The air in the hall seemed to grow heavy, charged with something ancient and powerful. Then Felicia began to read aloud. Her voice was soft but clear, carrying through the hall with unexpected strength. She spoke in the modern tongue, translating the primordial language with perfect fluency, as though she had been born speaking both. The words flowed from her like water from a spring, natural and effortless. The scroll was a warning. Written by the founders of the first werewolf kingdoms, the document spoke of sacred bonds and spiritual balance. It warned that leaders who treated the Luna bond as a political tool, who chose their mates based on strategy rather than genuine connection, would bring spiritual imbalance to their packs. The bond between Alpha and Luna was meant to be a reflection of the divine partnership between the moon goddess and the first wolf, a union built on mutual respect, understanding, and authentic devotion. When that bond became corrupted by ambition, or reduced to a contract, the spiritual foundation of the kingdom would begin to crumble. Slowly at first, then catastrophically. Alliances would falter. Trust would erode. The very pack bonds that held society together would weaken, leaving the realm vulnerable to chaos and ruin. As Felicia read, her voice never wavered. She did not add emphasis or dramatize the words. She simply translated, giving voice to warnings that had waited centuries to be heard. When she finished, she carefully rolled the scroll and placed it back on the velvet cushion. Then she raised her eyes to meet Alternac's gaze once more. The king stood frozen, his expression unreadable. Around them, the court remained silent, processing the implications of what they had just heard. The scroll was condemning the very political marriages that held the kingdom together. It was indicting the system that had kept peace through strategic alliances. It was, in essence, declaring that Alternac's marriage to Lysandra was spiritually illegitimate. And Felicia had just read that condemnation aloud, before everyone, knowing exactly what it meant. Alternac felt something strange and powerful moving through his chest. Admiration. Fascination. An almost desperate need to understand this woman who stood before him like a candle flame in a hurricane. Small, but somehow unconsumed by the forces around her. She possessed a gift he had never encountered. She had done what no one else in the kingdom could do. She had proven herself invaluable. His promise rang in his memory. Crown her as his Luna. Give her everything. Impulsively, driven by that same desperate loneliness that had haunted him for years, Alternac raised his voice so that every person in the hall could hear. I made a promise before these witnesses. Felicia Lupater has succeeded where every scholar and sage failed. She has read the words of the ancestors and brought their warning to light. Therefore, I will honor my word. I will end my current marriage and crown her as Luna of this kingdom. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted in protest. Others called out their support, whether genuine or opportunistic. Arguments broke out. Guards moved forward to maintain order. The carefully controlled environment of the court dissolved into chaos. Through it all, Alternac kept his eyes on Felicia, waiting for her gratitude, her joy, her acceptance. What he saw instead made his blood run cold. Felicia's expression had not changed to one of triumph or excitement. Instead, something that might have been disappointment flickered across her pale features. She took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice cut through the noise with unexpected force. No. The single word silenced the hall more effectively than any shout could have. Alternac stared at her, certain he had misheard. No one refused a king. No one rejected such power when it was freely offered. It was inconceivable, but Felicia's eyes held his without wavering, and when she continued, each word fell like a hammer blow. I will not accept your offer, Your Majesty. I will not take a crown built on the humiliation of another woman. I will not accept a title earned through broken promises and casual cruelty. The bond between Alpha and Luna is sacred, and it cannot be created through impulse or admiration or desperation. You do not know me. You know only that I possess a skill you need. That is not enough. She took a step closer, her small frame radiating a fierce dignity that made her seem suddenly larger than the towering king before her. You just read a warning about treating partnerships as political decisions, and your immediate response is to make exactly that mistake again. You would discard your current Luna as though she were a failed investment and replace her with me because I impressed you in a single moment. That is not honor. That is not wisdom. That is the behavior of a man who has never learned what true partnership means. Gasps echoed through the hall, followed by furious shouts. Several nobles demanded that Felicia be arrested for her insolence. Others called for immediate punishment. The guards looked to their king, waiting for the order. But Alternac could not speak. He felt as though he had been struck across the face, not with anger, but with the cold clarity of truth. Every word she had spoken was accurate. He had acted impulsively, driven by fascination and loneliness, without considering what his promise would mean to Lysandra, or what it would cost Felicia herself. He had treated the sacred bond as a reward to be distributed at his discretion. Felicia was not finished. Her voice dropped lower, but somehow it carried even more weight. A king who treats relationships as strategic decisions, who offers sacred bonds as payment for services rendered, does not understand what it means to have a Luna. You need someone to teach you that lesson, Your Majesty. But it will not be me, not like this, not when the foundation is built on another woman's pain and your own impulsive admiration. She turned away from him, facing the assembled court with her chin raised. I came here to translate a document because I was summoned. I have completed that task. I ask nothing more than permission to return to my home. Alternac finally found his voice, rough and strained. You dare refuse me! You dare lecture me in my own hall! Felicia turned back to him, and for just a moment, something like sadness crossed her features. I dare to tell you the truth, Your Majesty. Someone should have done so a long time ago. The hall erupted again, louder this time. Guards moved forward, unsure whether to restrain Felicia or simply remove her from the king's presence. Nobles shouted over one another, some demanding her execution, others fascinated by the unprecedented scene unfolding before them. Through the chaos, Alternac raised his hand. Instantly, silence fell. He looked at Felicia for a long moment, his mind churning with emotions he could not name. Rage, yes, but also something else, something that felt dangerously close to respect. She had risked everything to speak honestly. She had refused power to maintain her principles. She had seen through his impulsive declaration to the emptiness beneath it. And she was right. The realization was devastating. When he spoke again, his voice was controlled, but everyone in the hall could hear the strain beneath it. You will not be punished. Your skill is too valuable to waste, and your words, however insolent, contain truth I must consider. You will remain at the castle as a consultant. Your knowledge of ancient languages and traditions will serve the kingdom. Quarters will be prepared for you, and you will be compensated fairly for your service. He paused, then added, his eyes never leaving hers. But you will remain here. That is not a request. Felicia held his gaze for several heartbeats, then nodded once, a gesture that was neither submission nor acceptance, but simple acknowledgement. The guards escorted her from the hall. As she passed through the massive doors, every eye followed her small figure in its red dress, the woman who had done the impossible, refused a crown, and told the king truths no one else dared speak. But the most devastating moment came after Felicia had gone. Queen Lysandra rose from her throne, her movements graceful and controlled despite the fury that blazed in her eyes. She descended from the dais, her silk gown whispering against the stone floor, and stood before her husband. The court watched in horrified fascination as she removed her crown, a delicate circlet of silver and diamonds that she had worn for 7 years, and placed it on the steps at Alternac's feet. Her voice, when she spoke, was as cold and cutting as winter wind. You have made your position clear, husband. I am not enough. I have never been enough. And I will not remain in a marriage where my value is so easily dismissed before the entire court. I demand formal dissolution of our union. Alternac stared at her, seeing his wife clearly for perhaps the first time in years. The pain in her eyes, the rigid control she maintained to preserve her dignity, the years of loneliness that mirrored his own, but which he had never acknowledged. Lysandra, wait. I did not mean... But she was already turning away, her ladies-in-waiting hurrying to follow as she strode from the hall with her head held high. The sound of the doors closing behind her echoed like a death knell. Alternac stood alone on the dais, surrounded by his court, holding the crown of the woman he had failed so completely. Around him, nobles whispered and schemed, already calculating how this scandal would affect alliances and power structures throughout the realm. The king who ruled through strength and fear, who had never been defeated in battle or politics, had just been utterly destroyed by 2 women who refused to accept the roles he assigned them. And the night was only beginning. The weeks that followed were a masterclass in political and personal unraveling. Queen Lysandra did not leave the castle immediately, but she made her intentions crystal clear. She moved her belongings to separate quarters in a distant wing and refused all private audiences with the king. When they met at formal functions, her courtesy was impeccable and utterly cold. She performed her duties with the same efficiency she had always shown. But now there was an edge to everything she did, a barely contained fury that made even the boldest nobles step carefully around her. She demanded that the pack elders convene to formally dissolve the marriage. The request sent shockwaves through the kingdom. Such dissolutions were rare, particularly for alpha pairs, and they required extensive negotiation to address the political ramifications. The alliance between Lysandra's home pack and Alternac's kingdom had been the cornerstone of northern stability for nearly a decade. If that alliance crumbled, other packs would move quickly to exploit the weakness. Messengers rode out to inform Lysandra's family of the situation. The responses that returned were venomous. Her father, Alpha, of one of the most powerful northern packs, sent a letter so scathing that Alternac's advisors refused to read it aloud in council. The message was clear. The insult to Lysandra would be considered an insult to her entire pack. Retribution would follow. Border skirmishes increased. Trade agreements faltered. 3 packs that had been considering formal alliances with Alternac's kingdom withdrew their ambassadors. Rumors spread like wildfire through the realm, each version more dramatic than the last. The king had gone mad. He had fallen under a spell. He had insulted his queen for a commoner witch who had bewitched him with forbidden magic. Through it all, Felicia Lupater remained in her assigned quarters, seemingly oblivious to the chaos she had helped unleash. Her rooms were in one of the older sections of the castle, a tower that overlooked the eastern gardens. The furnishings were comfortable, but not luxurious. The walls lined with bookshelves that servants had filled with whatever ancient texts they could find. Felicia accepted the accommodations without complaint and immediately set to work, examining documents and artifacts that the royal archives had accumulated over centuries. She did not attend court functions. She did not seek audiences with the king. When nobles tried to approach her, hoping to forge alliances or extract gossip, she politely but firmly declined their company. She ate her meals in her chambers and spent her days surrounded by books and scrolls, her white hair gleaming in the lamplight as she worked through translations with meticulous care. The servants who brought her food and maintained her quarters reported that she was unfailingly courteous but distant. She never complained, never demanded special treatment, never asked about the king or the political situation. She simply worked, as though she were still in her small shop in that border town, undisturbed by the fact that she now resided in the castle of a king who had promised to make her his queen. Alternac received these reports and did not know what to feel. He spent his days managing the political fallout from his impulsive declaration. Councils stretched for hours as advisors argued about how to salvage relationships with allied packs. Military commanders warned that some territories were preparing for possible conflict. The treasury reported that trade had declined significantly, as merchants grew wary of the kingdom's instability. But in the quiet hours, when his duties were finished and he sat alone in his chambers, Alternac found his thoughts drifting to the woman in the eastern tower. He had not spoken to Felicia since that disastrous day in the Great Hall. Pride and shame kept him away, but he could not stop thinking about her words, the way she had looked at him with disappointment rather than fear, the truth she had spoken so plainly. You treat relationships as strategic decisions. You do not understand what it means to have a Luna. The words haunted him, because they were undeniably accurate. Alternac had spent his entire life learning to be a king. His father had been a brutal, demanding man who had taught him that power was the only currency that mattered. Strength, control, the ability to dominate others through sheer force of will. Emotions were weaknesses to be suppressed. Connections were tools to be exploited. Love was a luxury that kings could not afford. He had absorbed those lessons completely. He had become exactly the kind of ruler his father wanted, feared and obeyed, undefeated in battle, merciless to his enemies. He had married Lysandra because the alliance was strategically necessary, and he had never questioned whether there should be something more to the union. She was beautiful, capable, and appropriate. That was enough. Or so he had believed. But Felicia had shattered that certainty with a single refusal. She had shown him that there were people who valued principles over power, who would reject a crown to maintain their integrity, who understood that true partnership could not be manufactured through political maneuvering or impulsive declarations. And for the first time in his life, Alternac felt the crushing weight of his own ignorance. He did not know how to connect with another person beyond giving commands or negotiating alliances. He did not know how to be vulnerable or honest about his own needs. He had been so focused on maintaining his image as an invincible king that he had forgotten how to be simply human. The realization was devastating and, strangely, liberating. 1 month after the incident in the Great Hall, Alternac made a decision that shocked his advisors. He would personally oversee the formal dissolution of his marriage to Lysandra, not to fight against it, but to ensure that she received everything she was owed with honor and respect. The dissolution proceedings were held in a private chamber with only the pack elders present. Lysandra arrived dressed in formal regalia, her bearing regal and cold. When Alternac entered, she did not acknowledge him beyond a curt nod. The elders guided them through the ritual. Ancient words spoken over ceremonial fires, bonds severed through mutual declaration. It should have felt momentous. Instead, it felt like the formal acknowledgement of a truth that had always existed. They had never truly been partners. When the ritual concluded, Alternac spoke before Lysandra could leave. "I owe you an apology that words cannot adequately convey. I treated our marriage as a contract when it should have been a partnership. I failed you in every way that matters. You deserved a husband who valued you, and instead you received a king who saw only political advantage. I am profoundly sorry." Lysandra studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then quietly, she responded, "I accept your apology, though it changes nothing. I hope you learn from this, Alternac. I hope that when you eventually find someone who makes you feel something real, you do not make the same mistakes. But that person will not be me, and I am grateful for that." She left without another word, her entourage following. Within a week, she had departed the castle entirely, returning to her family's territory with her dignity intact and her freedom reclaimed. The political consequences were severe. 2 allied packs formally withdrew their support. Trade revenues declined by almost 30%. Neighboring kingdoms watched with predatory interest, sensing weakness. Alternac's advisors warned that the realm was becoming dangerously unstable. But the king found himself caring less about political calculations and more about fundamental questions he had never considered before. What kind of leader was he becoming? What kind of man did he want to be? And why could he not stop thinking about the woman in the Eastern Tower who had refused his crown and changed everything? 3 months after Felicia's arrival at the castle, the conspiracy began to take shape in shadows and whispered conversations. A faction of nobles, led by Duke Morrigan, a silver-tongued politician with ambitions that exceeded his wisdom, saw opportunity in the chaos surrounding the king's dissolved marriage. If Alternac could be proven weak or spiritually compromised, if his claim to the throne could be challenged through ancient law and religious doctrine, then perhaps someone else could step forward as a more suitable alpha. Morrigan and his followers began studying the same ancient texts that Felicia had been translating. They sought loopholes, forgotten rituals, spiritual justifications that could undermine the king's authority. They consulted with priests who held grudges against Alternac's secular policies, and with sages willing to interpret prophecy in self-serving ways. What they discovered was a forbidden ritual, one that had been banned for over 5 centuries, but which, if performed correctly, could sever an alpha's connection to his pack bonds entirely. The ritual required sacred objects, precise timing, and a location of spiritual power. But if successful, it would leave Alternac vulnerable to challenge, effectively forcing him to abdicate or face a combat trial he could not win without his connection to the pack. The conspirators moved carefully, acquiring the necessary components through intermediaries and coded messages. They planned to perform the ritual during the upcoming blood moon, a rare astronomical event that would amplify the spiritual energies needed for such dark work. But they made one critical mistake. They needed translations of specific ritual instructions from texts written in the primordial tongue. And there was only one person in the kingdom who could provide those translations. Duke Morrigan approached Felicia with what he believed was an irresistible offer. He arrived at her quarters one evening, accompanied by 2 other nobles, their expressions carefully arranged to project friendly concern. Felicia received them in her small sitting room, surrounded by books and parchments, her white hair pulled back in a simple braid. She offered tea, which they accepted, and listened as Morrigan explained his request. He framed it as an academic exercise. Certain ancient texts needed translating for the kingdom's spiritual archives. The work was sensitive, requiring discretion, but it would be generously compensated. He presented the documents with a smile that did not reach his eyes and waited for her agreement. Felicia took the documents and examined them in silence. The room grew tense as minutes passed. Morrigan shifted in his seat, his companions exchanging glances. Finally, Felicia looked up, and her pale eyes held an expression that made Morrigan's blood run cold. These are instructions for the severance ritual. It has been banned for 500 years because it causes irreparable harm to pack bonds and spiritual balance. You are planning to use this against the king. It was not a question. Morrigan recovered quickly, his politician's instincts taking over. He began to spin a story about how the ritual was merely being researched for historical purposes, how Felicia was overreacting, how she clearly did not understand the political complexities of the situation. Felicia stood, the movement so sudden that all three men jerked back in surprise. She held the documents at arm's length, as though they contaminated her by proximity. Get out. Take these with you. And know that if you attempt this ritual, I will personally ensure that the king learns of your treachery. The nobles blustered and threatened, but Felicia's expression never wavered. Eventually, they departed, taking their documents with them, their voices echoing down the corridor in angry discussion about how to proceed without her cooperation. Felicia sat back down, her hands trembling slightly as the adrenaline faded. She had made an enemy of powerful men. They would retaliate, either through political maneuvering or direct action. She was vulnerable, isolated in a castle where she had no allies and no protection beyond the king's vague command that she remain as a consultant. She could leave. She could pack her few belongings and slip away in the night, returning to her simple life where the games of kings and nobles could not touch her. But even as the thought formed, she knew she would not act on it, because somewhere in the past 3 months, despite her best efforts to remain detached, Felicia had begun to care about what happened to this kingdom, and to the broken, lonely king who ruled it. She gathered her notes and made her way through the castle's corridors toward the royal wing. Guards watched her with suspicious eyes, but she had become a familiar enough presence that they did not challenge her. She knocked on the heavy oak door of the king's private study and waited. Alternac's voice called out permission to enter, rough with exhaustion. When Felicia stepped inside, she found him surrounded by maps and correspondence, his long black hair disheveled, his beard untrimmed. He had removed his formal regalia and wore only a simple shirt and breeches. He looked up, and surprise flickered across his face when he recognized her. They had not spoken privately since the day she arrived. Alternac had maintained his distance, uncertain how to approach the woman who had rejected him so publicly and so accurately. Seeing her now, standing in his private study with determination written across her delicate features, he felt that same unsettling fascination return. Felicia closed the door behind her and moved to stand before his desk. There is a conspiracy forming against you. Duke Morrigan and his allies are planning to perform the severance ritual during the blood moon. They intended to use me to translate the instructions, but I refused. They will find another way or attempt it regardless, hoping to weaken you enough to challenge your rule. Alternac stared at her, processing the information. The severance ritual was legendary among their kind, a nightmare scenario that most believed was merely myth. If it could actually be performed successfully, the consequences would be catastrophic. Why are you telling me this? You owe me nothing. You made that clear when you refused my crown. Felicia's expression softened slightly, though her voice remained steady. I refused your crown because it was offered for the wrong reasons. That does not mean I wish to see you destroyed by treacherous nobles who care nothing for the kingdom's well-being. You are flawed, Your Majesty, and you have much to learn. But you do not deserve to be spiritually mutilated by ambitious fools playing with forces they do not understand. Alternac rose from his chair, moving around the desk to stand before her. He was so much larger, his presence overwhelming. But Felicia did not retreat. She tilted her head back to maintain eye contact, waiting for his response. "Tell me everything you know about the ritual, how it works, what they need, how to stop it." For the next hour, Felicia explained everything she understood about the ancient practice. The spiritual theory behind it, the components required, the specific location where such work could be performed, a place where ley lines converged beneath an old shrine in the castle's southern courtyard. She sketched diagrams and translated passages from memory, her knowledge far exceeding what any scholar in the kingdom possessed. Alternak listened intently, occasionally asking questions that revealed his sharp intelligence beneath the warrior's exterior. As she spoke, he found himself watching not just what she said, but how she said it. The careful precision of her words, the way her eyes lit up when she explained particularly complex concepts, the unconscious grace of her movements as she gestured to illustrate her points. She was extraordinary, not because of her beauty, though he was beginning to realize that her unusual coloring and delicate features were striking in their own way. Not because of her skills, though those were undeniably impressive, but because of the way she engaged with the world, approaching everything with careful thought and unwavering principle. When she finished her explanation, silence settled between them. Outside, night had fully fallen. A servant had lit the lamps at some point, casting warm golden light through the study. Alternak spoke quietly, a question that had been building for months finally finding voice. "Why do you care? You made it clear that you want no part of this court, no connection to me or my throne. You could have let them proceed, allowed them to weaken me, perhaps even seen me overthrown. Why warn me?" Felicia met his eyes, and for the first time since entering the study, she seemed uncertain. "Because I have spent my life studying the old ways, the traditions that bound our people together, the spiritual foundations that gave meaning to power. I believe in those principles even when others have forgotten them. And because," she hesitated, then continued, "because I have watched you these past months. I have seen you working to repair what you damaged. I have heard about how you handled the dissolution of your marriage, how you ensured Lysandra was honored despite everything. I have seen small signs that you are trying to become the kind of leader the ancestors envisioned." She paused, a faint flush coloring her pale cheeks. "I do not believe in you because you are powerful or because you offered me a crown. I believe in what you could become if you continue to learn and grow. That is worth protecting." The honesty of her words struck Alternak like a physical blow. No one had spoken to him this way, with hope rather than fear, with belief in his potential rather than submission to his authority. In that moment, something shifted in his chest, a wall he had not known he was building beginning to crack. "Help me stop them, please. Not as my Luna or my subject, but as someone who cares about what this kingdom could be." Felicia studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I will help you, but on one condition. Name it. When this is over, when the conspiracy is defeated, you will let me leave. You will not command me to stay. You will not make it a condition of my service. You will grant me the freedom to return to my own life." The request felt like a knife between his ribs, but Alternak nodded. "You have my word." Over the following weeks, they worked together to unravel the conspiracy and prepare a defense against the forbidden ritual. Alternak assigned his most trusted guards to shadow Duke Morrigan and his allies, documenting their movements and contacts. Felicia studied ancient texts to find potential countermeasures to the severance ritual, searching for spiritual protections that could blunt its effects. They met frequently in the king's study, often late into the night, comparing notes and refining their strategy. As they worked, something unexpected began to develop between them. It started with small moments. Alternak would bring Felicia tea without being asked, remembering that she preferred it unsweetened. Felicia would notice when exhaustion made the king's hands tremble and would insist he rest, her voice firm despite her small stature. They began to share more than just information about the conspiracy. Alternak spoke about his father, about the brutal lessons that had shaped him, about the loneliness that had defined his reign. Felicia talked about growing up with her strange gift, about being treated as either a curiosity or a threat, about building a life of quiet scholarship to escape the weight of others' expectations. They discovered shared experiences despite their vastly different positions. Both had been isolated by circumstances beyond their control. Both had learned to build walls to protect themselves. Both had sacrificed personal happiness for duty, though Felicia's duty was to preserving knowledge while Alternach's was to maintaining power. The attraction was inevitable, though both tried to resist it. Alternach had learned his lesson about impulsive declarations. He did not speak of his growing feelings, did not make promises or demands. Instead, he simply tried to show Felicia respect, to prove through actions rather than words that he valued her for who she was, rather than what she could give him. Felicia felt the pull toward him, but maintained her boundaries carefully. She had refused him once for good reason, and those reasons had not changed. He was still a king, learning how to see beyond power. She was still determined to preserve her independence. Allowing herself to care too deeply would compromise everything she believed in. But late at night, working side by side in the lamplight, their hands would brush as they reached for the same document. Their eyes would meet over some shared revelation, holding a beat too long. The air between them would grow heavy with unspoken possibility. They never acted on it. Neither crossed that invisible line, but the tension grew with each passing day. A thread stretched tighter and tighter, waiting to either snap or bind them together. 2 weeks before the blood moon, the guards reported that Duke Morrigan had acquired the final components needed for the ritual. The conspirators were meeting in secret, finalizing their plans. Everything was moving toward the inevitable confrontation. Felicia worked frantically to complete a protective ward that could shield Alternach from the worst effects of the severance ritual. The ward was complex, requiring her to inscribe symbols in silver ink on cloth that the king would need to wear against his skin during the ritual. The process was intimate, requiring precise measurements and multiple fittings to ensure the ward would align correctly with his spiritual centers. Alternach stood bare-chested in his chambers as Felicia carefully marked reference points on his skin with chalk, her touch professional, but sending electricity through his entire body. His scars from years of battle covered his torso, each one a story of violence survived. She traced the lines of his musculature with clinical precision, murmuring to herself as she calculated angles and proportions. "Hold still," she instructed, stepping closer to mark a point just above his heart. They were inches apart. Alternach could smell the faint scent of parchment and herbs that clung to her hair. He could see the intense concentration in her pale eyes, the way she bit her lower lip when she was focused. It would be so easy to reach out, to pull her closer, to finally speak the words that had been building inside him for months. But he had promised to respect her boundaries. So he remained still, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing carefully controlled, while she worked her careful magic on his willing body. When she finished, stepping back to survey her work, there was a flush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with exertion. "The ward will be ready in 3 days. You must wear it constantly from that point forward, even when you sleep. The protection will not be perfect, but it should prevent permanent damage if they succeed in initiating the ritual." Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she cleaned her tools. Alternach reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently took one of her hands in his. She froze but did not retreat. "Thank you. For everything. For warning me. For helping me. For teaching me to be better than I was." Felicia looked down at their joined hands, her white hair falling forward to hide her expression. "Do not thank me yet. We do not know if this will work. If we fail, we will not fail, not with you guiding me." She looked up then, and the vulnerability in her eyes nearly undid him. "Why did you change? After the Great Hall, after I refused you so publicly, you could have punished me or dismissed me as irrelevant. Instead, you listened. You grew. Why?" Alternac considered the question carefully before answering. Because you were right. Everything you said that day was accurate, and hearing it forced me to confront truths I had been avoiding my entire life. My father taught me that power was everything, that emotions were weakness, that a king stands alone. But you showed me that true strength comes from being honest enough to acknowledge your flaws and brave enough to change. You showed me that connection is not weakness, but the foundation of real leadership. He paused, then added quietly, his voice rough with emotion he no longer tried to hide. You made me want to be worthy of someone like you. Not to possess you or claim you as a prize, but simply to be someone you might respect. Someone you might, perhaps, choose to be near. Felicia's breath caught. For a moment the world narrowed to just the two of them, standing in the lamplight of the king's chambers, hands joined, walls crumbling. Then she gently pulled away, and the moment broke. I should go. There is still much work to be done. She fled before he could respond, leaving Alternac alone with the ghost of her touch on his skin, and the certain knowledge that he was falling in love with a woman who would leave him the moment their immediate purpose was fulfilled. The night of the blood moon arrived with ominous stillness. The sky was clear, stars brilliant against the darkness, the moon rising red and swollen above the castle walls. Throughout the grounds, servants and nobles went about their evening routines, unaware of the spiritual battle about to unfold. In the southern courtyard, hidden behind an old shrine that most had forgotten existed, Duke Morrigan and 6 other conspirators gathered with their stolen artifacts and forbidden knowledge. They had bribed guards to look the other way, convinced other nobles that their absence from the evening's festivities would go unnoticed. They had prepared for months for this moment. But in the king's private chambers, Alternac was also preparing. Felicia helped him don the protective ward, the cloth she had inscribed with silver symbols sitting directly against his skin beneath his formal attire. Her hands were steady as she secured the garment, though her eyes held deep worry. Remember, the ward will blunt the worst effects, but you will still feel the ritual trying to sever your bonds. It will be painful, disorienting. You must hold on to your connection to the pack, to your sense of self, until I can complete the counter-ritual. Alternac caught her hands before she could step away, holding them firmly. If something goes wrong, if I fall, promise me you will escape. Do not try to save me. Just run. Felicia shook her head fiercely. I am not leaving you to face this alone. We finish this together or not at all. The determination in her voice was absolute. Alternac realized that arguing would be pointless. So instead, he lifted her hands to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture of gratitude and something deeper that he did not have words to express. They went together to the southern courtyard, accompanied by the king's most loyal guards. They moved quietly through shadow-draped corridors, avoiding areas where the conspirators might have placed watchers. When they reached the old shrine, they could already hear chanting. The conspirators stood in a circle around the convergence point, their voices rising and falling in an ancient rhythm that made the air itself feel wrong. Dark energy swirled in the center of their formation, visible as distortions in the moonlight. They had already begun. Alternac stepped forward, his massive frame blocking the entrance to the shrine area, his voice booming across the courtyard. Stop this now, and I will show mercy. Continue, and you will be tried for treason. Duke Morrigan spun around, shock and fury warring on his face as he realized they had been discovered. For a moment it seemed he might actually halt the ritual. Then ambition overrode caution, and he screamed for the others to finish. The chanting intensified. The dark energy in the center of the circle exploded outward, reaching for Alternac with invisible tendrils that sought to tear his connection to his pack bonds. The king staggered as pain lanced through him, every nerve ending screaming, as the severance ritual tried to rip away the fundamental part of what made him alpha. But the ward held. The silver symbols Felicia had inscribed glowed beneath his clothing, creating a barrier that deflected the worst of the attack. Alternac remained standing, though blood trickled from his nose and his hands shook with the effort of resistance. Felicia was already moving. She had brought her own materials, components for a counter-ritual that would disrupt the conspirators' working and sever their connection to the dark energies they had summoned. She began her own chanting, words in the primordial tongue that resonated with power far older than the forbidden ritual the traitors were attempting. The two forces collided in the air above the courtyard, visible as shimmering distortions of reality itself. The conspirators screamed in effort, pouring everything they had into completing the severance. Felicia's voice never wavered, her small form radiating determination as she spoke words that had not been heard in centuries. Alternac, still fighting off the effects of the attack, began to move forward. Each step was agony, his wolf howling inside him as it felt the bonds trying to tear free, but he kept going, driven by fury and desperation, and the absolute certainty that he could not let these traitors destroy everything. The guards moved in from the sides, surrounding the conspirators even as they maintained their ritual circle. But as long as the chanting continued, as long as the dark energy flowed, no one could cross into the circle without being destroyed. Then Felicia's counter-ritual reached its crescendo. She shouted a final phrase, her voice amplified by ancient magic, until it echoed across the entire castle grounds. The silver symbols on Alternac's ward blazed with brilliant light, and that light spread outward, creating a wave that crashed through the conspirators' circle like a tsunami breaking a fragile dam. The severance ritual shattered. The dark energy dissipated in an explosion that knocked everyone in the courtyard to the ground. The conspirators screamed as the backlash of their broken working struck them, spiritual pain that would leave scars they would carry for the rest of their lives. When the chaos settled, Alternac stood at the center of the courtyard, battered but intact, his pack bonds secure. His guards quickly restrained the conspirators, who lay groaning and defeated on the cold stone. But the king's attention was not on his defeated enemies. He turned, searching frantically, until he spotted Felicia. She had collapsed, the exertion of performing such powerful magic having drained her completely. Alternac ran to her side, dropping to his knees and gathering her small body into his arms. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and she tried to smile. "Did it work? Are you?" "I am fine. You saved me. You saved all of us." Tears tracked through the dirt on her pale face, and she reached up to touch his cheek with trembling fingers. "Good. That is good." Then her eyes closed, and she went limp in his arms, unconscious from sheer exhaustion. Alternac carried her back to her chambers himself, refusing to let anyone else touch her. He laid her carefully on her bed and sat beside her through the long hours of the night, watching her breathe, his hand holding hers as though he could anchor her to the waking world through sheer force of will. She had risked everything to protect him. She had stood against powerful magic and won because she believed he was worth saving. And as he sat there in the darkness, Alternac finally admitted to himself what he had been fighting for months. He loved her. Completely. Irrevocably. Not because of her skills or her gifts, but because of who she was, the fierce principles that guided her, the courage that burned in her small frame, the way she saw the world with such clarity and compassion. But she had made him promise to let her go when this was over. And unlike his past self, the man who made careless promises and thoughtless declarations, Alternac would honor his word, even if it destroyed him. Felicia woke 2 days later, weak but intact. The conspiracy had been completely dismantled. Duke Morrigan and his allies were awaiting trial, their political influence shattered, their reputations ruined. The ritual's failure had sent a clear message to anyone else contemplating rebellion. The king was protected not just by military might, but by forces far older and more powerful than political ambition. Word of Felicia's role in saving the kingdom had spread rapidly. Suddenly, the woman who had been dismissed as a common translator was being hailed as a spiritual guardian, a keeper of ancient wisdom who had preserved the throne and the pack bonds that held the realm together. Nobles who had whispered cruel gossip about her now sought audiences, hoping to gain her favor. Priests requested her consultation on matters of tradition and ritual. She hated every moment of the attention. Felicia had never wanted recognition or status. She had acted because it was necessary, because failing to act would have violated everything she believed in. The idea of leveraging that action into political capital or social standing felt repulsive. When she was strong enough to walk, she made her way to the king's study. Alternac was there, as she knew he would be, surrounded by documents related to rebuilding the alliances that had been strained during the dissolution of his marriage and the recent conspiracy. He looked up when she entered, and the relief that flooded his face was almost painful to witness. "You are well." It was not a question, but she nodded anyway. "I am recovering, and I have come to remind you of your promise." The light in his eyes dimmed, but he nodded slowly. "You wish to leave." Felicia moved to stand before his desk, her hands clasped in front of her, her white hair catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows. "My work here is complete. The conspiracy is defeated. The ancient texts have been catalogued and translated. The kingdom is stable. There is nothing more for me to do." She paused, then added more quietly, "And I am not meant for this life. The politics, the attention, the constant scrutiny. I am a scholar and a translator. I belong with my books and my quiet work, not in the halls of power." Alternac rose from his chair and came around the desk, but he maintained careful distance, respecting the boundaries she had established. "You saved my kingdom, my life. You taught me more about leadership and integrity than anyone ever has. I owe you everything." He took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. "I promised that when this was over, I would let you leave. I will honor that promise. You are free to go, with my gratitude and my blessing. I will ensure you have resources, protection, anything you need to live comfortably wherever you choose to settle." Felicia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and for a moment, her composure cracked. "Thank you for keeping your word. It means more than you know." She turned to leave, but before she reached the door, Alternac spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I need you to know something before you go. Not because I expect anything in return, but because you deserve honesty." She stopped but did not turn around. "I love you, Felicia. Not as a subject or a consultant or a convenient solution to my political problems. I love you as a man. Loves a woman he admires and respects and wants beside him. Not because she was promised or assigned, but because she chooses to be there. I love your principles and your courage and your brilliant mind. I love the way you see the world and refuse to compromise what you believe in." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "But I also understand that love is not enough. You were right when you said that impulse and admiration cannot create true partnership. Real connection requires choice, freely given, built over time through shared experience and mutual respect. I am still learning what that means, and I will not ask you to stay while I learn. You deserve better than to be someone's lesson in how to care for another person." Silence filled the study. Felicia stood with her back to him, her shoulders trembling slightly. When she spoke, her voice was thick with tears. "You have become the kind of man I hoped you could be, the kind of leader who deserves loyalty and love. But you are right that it is not enough. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. Some stories do not end with romance and coronations. Some stories end with people choosing themselves and their own paths, even when staying would be easier or more comfortable." She finally turned to face him, and the tears streaming down her face caught the light like diamonds. "I will always be grateful that I met you, that I was able to witness your transformation. But I cannot be your Luna, Alternac. I cannot be the person who validates your growth or proves that you have become better. You must continue that journey for yourself, Not for me or any other woman. That is the final lesson. She crossed the room then, moving to stand directly before him. She reached up, her small hand touching his bearded cheek gently. Goodbye, Alpha King. Rule well. Love wisely. And know that somewhere in this world, someone is proud of the man you have become. Then she stretched up on her toes and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek, a gesture of farewell that held more tenderness than any passionate embrace. When she stepped back, Alternac did not try to stop her. He simply stood there, memorizing every detail of her face, committing this moment to memory so that he would carry it with him always. Felicia walked to the door, opened it, and left without looking back. She departed the castle the next morning, before dawn, taking only what she could carry in a single pack. No fanfare, no official farewell, just a small figure in a red dress, slipping through the gates as the guards changed shifts, disappearing into the world beyond like a ghost returning to whatever realm had birthed her. The months that followed were difficult for Alternac. He threw himself into governing with renewed dedication. He personally traveled to the territories whose alliances had been strained, rebuilding trust through consistent, honorable action. He reformed policies that had been unjust, consulted with pack elders about spiritual matters he had previously dismissed, and worked tirelessly to become the kind of leader Felicia had believed he could be. But the loneliness was profound. His chambers felt emptier than they ever had before. The study where they had worked together seemed haunted by her absence. Every time he encountered an ancient text or heard someone discuss old traditions, he thought of her, wondered where she was, what she was translating, if she ever thought of him. His advisors cautiously suggested that he should consider remarrying, that the kingdom would be stronger with Aluna. Alternac refused. He would not repeat his past mistakes. If he ever took another partner, it would be because they chose each other with full awareness and mutual respect, not because protocol demanded it. Years passed. The kingdom prospered under Alternac's reformed leadership. He became known throughout the realm as the Alpha King, who had transformed from a brutal warrior into a wise, just ruler. Stories spread about the dissolution of his political marriage, the conspiracy he had defeated, and the mysterious scholar who had appeared, saved the throne, and then vanished. Some of the stories claimed Felicia had been a spirit sent by the moon goddess to test the king. Others insisted she was simply an exceptionally gifted woman who valued her independence. The truth, as with most legends, was somewhere in between. Alternac never forgot her. He kept the original scroll, the one she had read in the great hall that first day, locked in a case in his private chambers. Not as a trophy or a reminder of prophecy, but as a symbol of the woman who had refused his power and changed him forever. He would stand before it sometimes, late at night when sleep eluded him, and remember her voice speaking those ancient words. Remember her pale eyes meeting his without fear. Remember the way she had walked away rather than compromise her principles. And in those moments, alone in the darkness, Alternac would acknowledge a truth he shared with no one. He would never love anyone the way he loved Felicia Lupater. She had been his chance at genuine connection, and he had squandered it with impulsive promises and thoughtless declarations. By the time he had learned how to truly see her, how to value her for who she was rather than what she could give him, it was too late. Some lessons came with permanent costs. Some mistakes could not be undone, only learned from. But if the price of his growth was loneliness, if the cost of becoming a better man was losing the woman who had inspired that transformation, then Alternac would pay it without complaint. Because Felicia had taught him that true leadership meant accepting consequences, honoring promises, and valuing others' autonomy, even when it hurt. 10 years after Felicia left the castle, on a night when the moon hung full and bright above the kingdom, Alternac stood at his window looking out over the city he had sworn to protect. He was older now, his black hair threaded with silver, his face marked by years of bearing the weight of the crown. But his eyes were clearer than they had been in his youth. his decisions guided by wisdom rather than mere power. The kingdom was at peace. The alliances were strong. The people prospered. Everything he had worked so hard to build was flourishing. And yet, in the quietest part of his heart, Alternac whispered a prayer to the moon goddess that somewhere in the world, Felicia Lupater was happy, that she had found the quiet life she craved, surrounded by her books and her scholarly work, free from the demands of courts and kings, that she thought of him sometimes, not with regret or sadness, but with the knowledge that their brief time together had mattered, that she knew he had become the man she believed he could be, even if she would never see it for herself. The prayer went unanswered, as most do, disappearing into the vast night sky. But somehow, standing there in the moonlight, Alternac felt a strange peace settle over him. Not happiness exactly, but acceptance. The kind of quiet resolution that comes from knowing you have lived according to principles you believe in, even when those principles came at great personal cost. He was alone. He would likely remain alone. But he was no longer lonely in the way he had been before Felicia arrived, because she had taught him that true connection was not about possession or proximity, but about recognizing another person's inherent worth and honoring their choices, even when those choices led them away from you. Some people enter your life not to stay, but to transform it. They teach you lessons that reshape everything you thought you knew about yourself and the world. They show you who you could become if you have the courage to change. And then they leave, trusting that you will continue the journey they started. Felicia had been that person for Alternac. And though she was gone, though he would never hold her or share late nights working side by side again, her influence remained. In every just decision he made, in every moment he chose honesty over expedience, in every time he respected someone's autonomy even when commanding them would be easier. She had refused his crown and given him something far more valuable, the knowledge of how to be worthy of one. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and blooming night flowers. Alternac closed his eyes and breathed deeply, accepting what was and what would never be. Then he turned from the window and returned to his desk, where documents awaited his attention, and the endless work of governing continued. He picked up his pen, reviewed a petition from a small border village requesting aid for their harvest festival, and signed the approval without hesitation. The kingdom needed him. His people needed him. And he would serve them with everything he had learned from the woman who walked away, carrying with her his heart and his gratitude, and a piece of his soul that would forever bear her name. Outside, the moon continued its eternal journey across the sky, bearing witness to the countless stories of love and loss that played out beneath its silver light. And in one of those stories, a king ruled alone but well, transformed by a woman who understood that the greatest gift you can give someone is the freedom to become their best self, even if that means letting them go. That was the final lesson, the one that completed his transformation. Real love did not demand or possess or control. Real love honored and released and trusted. It recognized that some connections, however profound, were meant to be catalysts for growth rather than permanent fixtures. Some people came into your life to teach you how to be whole, and then departed so you could practice that wholeness on your own. Alternac had become that whole person. The crown sat easier on his head now, no longer a burden of inherited expectation, but a responsibility he had earned through painful growth. His kingdom flourished because he had finally learned what Felicia tried to teach him that very first day, that true partnership cannot be commanded or purchased or declared into existence through impulsive promises. And so the story ended not with a grand romantic reunion, but with something quieter and perhaps more meaningful. A man who had learned to be content with himself, who ruled with wisdom and compassion, who honored the memory of the woman who had shown him a better way without needing her presence to validate his growth. In the years that followed, other opportunities for connection would arise. potential partners who admired the king he had become, women who might have made suitable Lunas, but Alternak never pursued those possibilities with any real intent. Not because he was holding out hope that Felicia would return. That was a fantasy he had long since released, but because he had learned the difference between genuine connection and convenient companionship. If love came to him again, it would come naturally, built on mutual choice and authentic feeling. Until then, he would continue his work, lead his people, and carry within him the lessons of a woman in a red dress who had refused a crown and given him something far more precious, the chance to become worthy of one. The scroll remained in its case. The memory remained vivid. And the love, unspoken and unreturned, remained as pure as the day he first understood it, untarnished by resentment or regret. Some stories do not end with happily ever after. Some end with wisdom earned and changes made, and lives forever altered by brief, transformative encounters. Those stories lack the satisfaction of traditional endings, but they carry a different kind of power, the power of truth. This was truth. Alternak Nymus had been a king defined by strength and fear and lonely power. Then a woman named Felicia Lupater arrived, read an ancient warning, refused an impossible offer, and showed him how to be better. And though she left, though he never saw her again, though the love between them was never consummated or celebrated or given the ending that romantic souls crave, it still changed everything. He ruled alone, but he ruled well. And every night, when the castle grew quiet and the moon rose over the kingdom, the Alpha King would remember the scholar who had seen past his power to the lonely, broken man beneath, who had cared enough to tell him hard truths, who had walked away with grace and dignity, trusting him to continue growing without her. And he did, because that was the final gift she had given him, the belief that he could. Years turned to decades. Alternak's reign became legendary. Future generations would study his transformation, debate the mysterious scholar who had appeared and vanished, argue about whether the story was literal or metaphorical. Historians would write volumes about his reforms and his diplomatic achievements. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between official accounts and public record, there remained the simple truth of two people who had connected briefly and profoundly, who had changed each other, and who had parted ways, because staying together would have compromised everything they both believed in. That was love, too. Not the kind celebrated in songs or captured in paintings. Not the kind that ended with crowns and ceremonies, but the kind that recognized that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is let someone go. Sometimes the deepest connection is one that exists as potential rather than possession. Sometimes the greatest transformation comes not from getting what you want, but from learning why you wanted it in the first place. Alternak learned those lessons. He lived them. And when his reign finally ended, when age and time claimed him as they claim all mortal beings, his final thoughts were not of power or legacy or the many battles he had won. They were of a woman with white hair and pale skin, standing in his study, speaking truth with gentle firmness, teaching him, through her refusal and her departure, what it truly meant to honor another person's autonomy and value their freedom as much as their presence. She had refused his crown. And in doing so, she had given him something far more valuable, the wisdom to wear it well. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this beautiful love story. Let us know what you thought of this tale full of emotions and surprises. Tell us your name, where you're watching from, and rate this story from 0 to 10 if it touched your heart. And if you enjoyed the plot, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the amazing new stories coming soon. See you next time.